I'm Kathy Newcomer, and I am welcoming you on behalf of the George Washington University's Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration. We're a graduate school that prepares students for public service and also PhDs for academe and other roles. Clearly, grants management is a topic of great importance to everybody in public service. Grants touch so many people, not only within government, but throughout society. We believe it's so important our students understand how this whole system works. It's complex. And we are just delighted to partner with REI Systems with the survey, the results of which you're going to hear today, as well as the breakfasts, which we used to hold right in the Student Center at GW, and I hope to do that again soon. But welcome. This is an exciting, once a year we hear what people think, and we have a wonderful panel of people that have the expertise to really give us some great insights. So I'm delighted that you're joining us, and I'm going to hand this over to my partner here, Jeff Myers from REI Systems. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and thank all of you for joining us. Just a quick anecdote, I was conducting a performance management training yesterday for grant managers at NASA, and I congratulated them on the success of Perseverance, the NASA rover that was just successfully landed on Mars. And that's a great story because it inspires us. The landing worked, it uses fantastic technology with robots that looked around the ground for the best places to land, and that technology was acquired from small businesses using grants. It happens that as a grants management story, that was something where REI Systems as a grants management company was helping NASA to identify the small business awardees and to process and manage their grants. One of the results of that tool, and the grants tool, and in fact the grants managers work at NASA, was that this landing was successful. But it will also be important that those tools for NASA are commercialized, that those companies create jobs, and frankly, that they add to the economy at the same time they serve NASA's mission of advancing scientific knowledge and exploring our universe. That mission, frankly, and that success, that performance was made possible by grants and by grants managers like many of you. So I want to thank, not just as I did with the NASA grant managers yesterday, I want to thank each of you for your service in helping carry out important public missions using grants, and to express my hope that this grants management survey that will give you some good ideas, help solve some problems, and strengthen the grants management community. If we go to the next slide, for those of you who have participated in this before, some of this may seem like you've heard it, but let me just give you a brief introduction. We conduct this survey annually, and we've done so for the past 5 years. We think it's important because it helps you see beyond your own job and your own organization. You're not the only one facing some of the challenges you see, and there are some other people in the community that may be able to share with you some good ideas about how to address your challenges, and we'll be really interested in hearing about your successes. Each year we make a few revisions to the survey. Most of it stays the same to give us some good trends. In the past, those revisions have included adding questions about performance management, administrative burden. This year, the big new questions were, frankly, and not surprisingly, about COVID. We think that the survey's results will help you, but frankly, it's not just about helping you, it's actually about helping the entirety of government do a better job working through grants and setting kind of opportunities and planning opportunities to coordinate and collaborate on a broader basis. We've assembled a great panel of grant managers to help understand and discuss some of the results of the survey this year. They're designed intentionally to include folks from the federal sector, the nonprofit sector, the state and local sector. And they include this year Blanca Rodriguez, a senior grants policy analyst for the U.S. Department of Education; Craig Fisher, an innovation program manager who's been working with blockchain and grants at the U.S. Department of the Treasury; LaShawn Henderson, who is the director of grants compliance for a recipient, Valencia College, and is also a member of the National Grants Management Association; Eric Russell, a senior manager with Crow LLP, an accounting firm that works heavily with grants-based clients, who is also vice president of NGMA; and finally, Andrew Goldschmidt, the executive director of the National Grants Management Association. So we're looking forward to sharing with you the results. We'll do that over the first 30 minutes or so of this presentation. Then we'll invite those panelists to answer a few questions. They may ask questions, and we'll invite you as the audience to ask questions as well, You can ask questions generally using the question feature of GoToWebinar, and you can certainly ask them of either the panelists or of us as the survey developers and administrators. There are about 650 folks who registered, so we'll have to ask you to type your questions in via GoToWebinar. We may be able to unmute you on occasion if there are folks who want to ask questions orally. Moving on, I always believe in trying to kind of share the big picture up front. So if we move to the next slide, please, Ashley, let me share with you just the highlights, and we'll hear more about these in detail as we go along. The first, unfortunately, it's incomplete. It is that still more time is spent by grant managers on compliance than any other task. And so we'll ask questions about what can be done about that. Is that a problem? Second, there was a big increase in the reports of administrative spending in 2020. This is in proportion to grant value. How much of the grant value that your organization manages or disperses is made up of by the administrative budget of your organization. We'll explore a little bit about why that is and begin to think about what can be done about it or if something should be done about it. The third topic is that many grant managers have a hard time measuring performance and the results that are achieved by their grants. It's not surprising for grantors because they're not the ones that are actually spending the money and taking the actions. But we want to talk a little bit maybe about grant recipients and about, again, why this happens, what can be done about it. Finally, it was clear from the survey responses that COVID has had a big impact on the majority of grant managers in several ways. And we'll share some details on that. And again, kind of ask some questions about what does that mean? How can folks, are those impacts permanent? And how have folks managed to address those so that you can learn from each other as we go along. The table of contents is that we'll kind of, again, give a 30-minute overview of the results of the survey. We'll talk a little bit about survey methods and respondents quickly, and then about the kind of the topics of the time managers use, how they spend it, what we can learn about performance, and then highlight the issues that got the strongest support or the strongest opposition from amongst the respondents to the survey. We'll identify what folks saw as the biggest challenges and their key success factors, and then can conclude with key takeaways. So Ashley, if we can move on to the slide that has the overview of REI, the next slide, overview of REI and GW. I've been a senior director at REI Systems for about 10 years and a subject matter expert on government performance for 30 years. And I just, as a brief introduction, want to offer you, COVID has really changed my life. And this may come as a surprise to some of you who know me, because like all of you, I have not had COVID, but like all of you, I now telework full time. Unlike you, I'm doing this from Africa. Actually, I'm sitting in Uganda right now because my wife is a grant manager, and she received a foreign service assignment as a health program manager for the U.S. Agency for International Development here in Uganda. So there's been a little bit of a silver lining for us. I'm able to keep my job and contributing in the ways that I like to government success. I'm going to be joined by Rajita Waknis, my colleague here, who's REI's deep dyed-in-the-wool grant expert and has worked with a bunch of different federal grant-making agencies over a series of years to improve their processes, their systems, and their performance. We appreciate that the National Grants Management Association has joined us in this effort. They provide tools, resources, training, and camaraderie for you as grants managers. We hope many of you can join NGMA's annual grants training in April. If you have questions, see ngma.org, or you can certainly contact any of the NGMA folks that are participating in this conversation. And of course, this would not be possible without the George Washington University, the Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration. And we're always indebted to Kathy Newcomer, the former dean, former director, and current professor. GW helped structure the initial survey and helps us make sure that we are doing a great job with the survey analysis. The last thing is that if you're not familiar with these events, we do, again, with George Washington, host an annual every other month breakfast forum that is, again, focused on creating collaboration and strengthening knowledge in the community. It's a sense of community within the grants management arena. So with all that, let's get to the crux of it, which is the survey results. The survey is not a random sample. Please keep in mind that we can only get information from the folks who are kind enough to respond. We got enough responses that we think it provides some really valuable information, though. We're going to be happy to share details and more questions, but I'm going to move through it relatively quickly because, again, we want the focus to be on the panel discussion and on your questions. So, Ashley, if we can move to the respondent mix. One of the things to notice about this is the blue bar kind of indicates people who are both a grant recipient and a grant maker. Lots of you wear two hats. And as well, many of the largest group of respondents are non-governmental organizations. So I think we should all recognize that non-governmental, nonprofit organizations are doing a bulk of the work in carrying out the public missions that are achieved through grants. As you look at the years of experience, a significant and frankly a stable majority of you have lots of experience, more than 10 years. But the profession is actually refreshing itself. There are still a significant number of folks who've newly joined. I always kind of think it's funny, I've never met a person yet who started out near the beginning of their career saying, I want to grow up to be a grant manager. So we got to think a little bit about how to both recruit those new folks and perhaps help them learn the ropes. So if we move on to the next kind of major segment, it is essentially how grant managers spend their time, with the next slide or two, Ashley. And that question, I think, is something that really is hard to picture for each of you individually, but the beauty of the survey is that it gives us a picture across the board for grant managers from the several different levels and, of course, several different sorts of roles. What we see here is that folks still spend a significant amount of time, more than any other topic, on compliance. Monitoring financial administrative requirements and non-financial requirements are the two things that kind of make those up. What that's telling us is we're frankly asking folks whether they're focused on space exploration at NASA or whether they're focused on COVID, malaria, and Ebola here in Uganda. We're asking them not to spend as much time on those programs as they do spend on administering the grant. We'd like to think and hope that it's possible with better technology, perhaps with blockchain, as Craig Fisher may be able to describe, that we can reduce the need for that administrative effort using some new and different techniques in the future, and that perhaps could be a focus of energy government-wide to be able to let people spend more time on the mission, on the science, and on the navigation for the Mars rover, as it were. Let's then move on, though, to talk a little bit about training briefly. And again, it's just kind of getting a background understanding, which is that dropping kind of a hint early, well-trained and well-qualified staff were seen to be one of the biggest success factors across all survey respondents. But that's kind of a little bit of a misconnect because relatively few organizations require training. And even of those that do, very few of them are going to require some sort of certification. So the questions that we'll have here is just, if this is so important to success, what should we do about it? Are we doing the right things? And we'll have a couple of our panelists kind of who've been thinking about that over the last several weeks, ready to chat about that. But again, we'd be happy to hear ideas from you as the audience as well. Moving on to the next topic, and again, feel free to start if you'd like, putting questions you may have into the question box. We're not going to try and answer them until a little later in the presentation, but if there's something that comes to mind, feel free to open that question box and type in your questions now. With respect to administrative spending on grants, I want to emphasize government America really works pretty well in a number of ways. It really only costs pennies on the dollar for the IRS to collect taxes. And you know what? Just this past week, we managed to pinpoint a specific location on Mars where we wanted the rover to land and make sure that it was safe for the rover to do so, so it didn't crash and burn. That success, that efficiency, frankly, comes from effective public managers like you. So this topic, frankly, is about kind of the ways that grant managers can both observe success and as well be more efficient about it, perhaps. It's really intended to contribute to a dialogue. We want your expertise and opinions to be known and your voices heard, but also to think a little bit more about how we can better, how we can improve. And I'll be very upfront, as we look at this surprised me. I was expecting that we would be dispersing more money on grants with COVID as we try and fight COVID and try and provide testing and treatment, and as well increase knowledge and spend money on vaccines. So I thought we would have more money going out the door for grants to COVID, same number of people working hard. I thought the proportion between the administrative spend and the grants would shrink because of those dynamics, but that was not the case. And in fact, it seems pretty consistent across every sector. Administrative spending went up as a proportion of grant value by 30 to 40% or more. So we're going to ask, and I cheated by giving this question to our panelists 2 or 3 weeks ago. We're going to ask, why is this? And will it or should it persist? And what should we do about it? And these are things that may be addressable perhaps by individual agencies and grant program and managers, Perhaps in some cases, again, maybe it calls for a government-wide effort. So let's look onward then at the next topic, which is performance of grants and grant managers and grant programs, and the burden perhaps that's placed as we ask for details and information about that performance. The key topics here are really collectively, how can we get the best performance, whether it be from the Perseverance rover or, for example, for anti-malaria efforts from USAID in Uganda. At the same time, though, we want to try and leave grant recipients without much burden so that they can spend as much time as possible doing the job well. What you see here, and bluntly kind of in helping design the survey, this was a trick question. Part of the issue is to understand, as the question asks, has performance improved or not? Part of the issue is to kind of understand, are you able to measure performance? And so the results that you see here are that in the majority of cases, actually performance is, or in a significant portion of cases, performance is not known, not measured. And in a few instances, the performance is improving, and actually that seems to be more significantly the case at the federal level, but that's not so much the case at the state and local and non-governmental levels. And again, I think it's important to kind of have a discussion starting today, but not finishing today, about why that is and what can be done about it. Perhaps some of the performance management kind of orientation and training that I shared with NASA folks would be useful for a broader range of managers. You know, perhaps that falls into Kathy Newcomer and GWU's bailiwick of kind of providing academic training, or perhaps professional training that folks like NGMA or some of the other organizations for grants professionals could be delivering. So I think those are important questions to address. And also certainly, of course, the differentiation between state and local and NGO needs and federal needs, because there are different perspectives at each of those levels. If we move on to the next slide, we talk about kind of the pandemic, and in fact, it has affected outcomes in a number of instances. This is, again, a subjective judgment based on a kind of a quick response to the survey from recipients, but a significant majority of the recipients, the survey respondents, indicate that there has been an impact. And in fact, both the blue and the gray, if you add together, that's a dramatic 75% or more of respondents said, yes, the pandemic's affected us. And in the gray bars, up to 2/3 of folks said it's affected us significantly by more than 5%. So the performance has been impacted by the pandemic. Again, I think that's a kind of a different picture. How it's been impacted, why it's been impacted, what to do about it, whether it's a permanent impact will vary by program. So we can have a little bit of a discussion about each of those. And once again, I'm trying to move through these fairly quickly because I think that the interesting portion of this conversation will be with the discussion. The next topic, if you look at it, is with respect to kind of self-reporting data. And here, I think the issue is kind of financial data often comes from a system and is audited or is provided by a third party, but that's not very often the case for the bulk of types of information that are coming through in performance reporting in the grants management community. One of the things I like to point out is that folks, especially in government, maybe less so in NGOs, tend to look at data that's credible and comes frequently and is kind of perceived to be valid, like financial data that's audited, or the number of patients touched, where it kind of comes from a kind of a clear, bright line system. My experience, though, is that data that, and that tends to drive people a little bit towards thinking about efficiency and productivity. There's often a value in having that offset by information about quality or customer satisfaction, so that you don't become so efficient at the cost to customers or to grant program beneficiaries. And so that's something where, again, I think those are the most likely types of data to be self-reported. And the fact that they are self-reported may lead to some questions and conversations within the grant community about, how can we make sure there's a better balance perhaps between quality and customer satisfaction to the kind of the highly credible and frequent valid data sources for financial and for productivity. But moving on, and this was kind of, I was foreshadowing a little bit with the financial data on the next slide. Financial data is perceived to be the most timely, useful, and reliable. And so again, I think it's useful to say, will that be driving us in directions we really don't want our grant programs to go? And perhaps should we consider whether or not and how to address that in ways that are less burdensome and perhaps make better use of standardized data and technology? So with that, let me turn it over to Rajuta to talk about and a little bit identify the issues that are kind of those that are most strongly supported and those that are most strongly opposed by survey respondents. Rajuta, please take it away.
Thank you, Jeff. Actually, you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the first chart you see on the left-hand side talks about how much we want to share data between the states, locals, and the federal government. And this is something where we continue to see really high scores. So we see the interest, the keenness there. And when you start talking about, well, what kind of data are you trying to share? The answer is usually financial performance and risk. On the financial side, we know we just talked about how that's frequently used as a measure of progress and information between the recipients and the grantors. And we know that a lot of the reporting on the federal side comes through the SF425 or the federal financial form, which is fairly fixed, and the data elements are, we know what they are. So that seems to be an area where some of this interactive automation can begin. We know that on the in HHS, they've actually started streamlining it to move to the payment management system. So all the HHS grantees now only have one place to enter that information. But we would expect that the evolution will be such that states or non-federal, non-government organizations can even start to post some of that data directly from their systems. So we're hoping that that's an area where we increase this automation a lot more. The performance data, of course, is much harder to automate. It's harder to define. It's harder to collect. So that becomes an area where we see a lot of work still to be done. But this is a community that we've been talking about this data automation a lot. So we're hoping that we will see some progress. And finally, risk data, defining what that is, defining what the elements are, and then how that gets shared. This is a topic we're going to discuss with the panel as well. What is the kind of data that should be shared, and how can we move forward on that? The chart you see on the right is where we ask about the impact of legislative or executive directives. And this is the first year where we start to see an impact of the GREAT Act that was passed in early 2020. You may know that the GREAT Act is trying to ask agencies to streamline the data element, to use this data standards, reduce the reporting burden, and eventually have all of the grantee reporting on a public website. So that's where the GREAT Act is trying to go. So it ties really well in terms of where the grant community is looking to share more data, and we're getting that legislative guidance from the government as well. Not surprisingly, the uniform guidance has the most impact on the grant community on a day-to-day basis, and we continue to see that year over year. Next slide, please, Ashley. The next chart asks about a risk monitoring strategy, and we are always happy to see that a majority of our recipients or our respondents continue to use a risk-based strategy for monitoring, and this means identifying the areas of risk and using that to hone in on where the oversight and monitoring occurs. And it's actually ticked up a little bit since last year, which is interesting. Again, is that an impact of COVID and some of the new recipients that came through because of that funding, or is that because there was more time spent on fraud, waste, abuse activities to ensure that the funding went in the right place? The next chart you see on this slide is about interest in analytics. We talked about data sharing and automation, and we continue to see a really high interest from leadership. And I will say here the word is interest, so that doesn't mean that they're using it, but this means that they're interested in getting the information so that they can make decisions. And when we ask about what kind of analytics are you looking for, our customers are usually talking about data around selection of applicants. If you're a grantor, if you're also a grantor, then monitoring the kind of information that's coming from the recipient so that they can do the monitoring. And then the workloads, meaning being able to identify where you need staff, when you need it, what are the cycles, so that they can manage the activities of the organization. So those are typically the areas where we see it. And then if you're a grantor or a grantee or a recipient, then of course the performance. So the analytics around how is the program doing, how is your funding being used, what is the measures that you've collected, and how are you going to improve that going forward. So those are typically the areas that we're seeing. Next slide, please. However, even though there is interest, everyone wants to share more data, leadership wants to see more analytics, we still see that the satisfaction with the systems that provide that data is fairly low. And we continue to see that both from the recipient side and the grantor side. So this is an area where we've talked about how can the community help, and I know that this is a panel discussion perhaps later as well. The next chart talks about confidence in ability to meet the program mission, and while it seems to have ticked up a little bit this year as well, we quantify this as, this is something where we think there needs to be improvement. If we're getting all of that funding, we want to be able to be confident that we're going to be able to meet the mission. Sometimes that's about being able to quantify whether we've met the mission or not, and sometimes it's about defining what the priorities of the mission are. So that's an area where we would like to see more improvement going forward. Actually, next slide, please. So as you can imagine, the automation is still an area where we see some concerns in terms of the direct data entry, meaning a portal or a place where you can go online or in some system and enter your data. If you count the direct data and data entry and email, there's only about 18% that are just doing direct data entry. 69% are still sending emails. And the emails causes, concerns in terms of loss of data, errors get made. We've heard anecdotally grantees saying that they've had to resend information, rescan information because emails have been lost. So that's something that sort of contributes to some of the burden on the recipient side. So this is an area where we think there's a lot of room for improvement, and this, addressing some of these concerns will have a significant impact on the reduction in burden on the recipient side. And the reason we want to do this is because we want to change the focus of time from actually, entering information and sending emails to servicing the community and providing the assistance using that funding. Next slide, please. Tying with that topic, the satisfaction with technology and the costs continues to be an area of concern. We see this as a consistent pain point, and this is an area we've talked about it before. What are the kind of things that we can do to address this? The ideas that have come up have been trying to leverage some of private industry. Can they step in and help out with some of these costs and access to technology? Nonprofits, there are some nonprofits that provide technology to local governments or tribal governments. Can we use some of those initiatives? Another idea that has come up has been to ask the federal government to allow the cost of technology in the administrative budget of grantees so that they can cover those costs and allow the reporting to happen seamlessly. And finally, another idea that has come up is to have the federal government provide perhaps 4 or 5 options to the recipients that they can then use to provide reporting. But of course, then the question around that is who would pay or organize or manage that model. So that's some of the ideas we've discussed before. Next slide, please. Moving into the significant challenges and success factors. Next slide. We continue to see that there is, in 2018, one of the big areas where we saw a big challenge was funding uncertainty. But that has, we don't see that anymore over the last 2 years. So either, that uncertainty has disappeared or people have figured out how to manage around that. But the inefficient bureaucratic processes continues to be a concern. This is where, the systems, the process that the standard operating procedures that have been set up to manage or provide the grants is still needs some improvement in terms of gaining efficiency. This year, though, we saw a big change in the attracting and retaining of well-qualified grants staff. And we talked a little bit about the training upfront when Jeff mentioned how many organizations actually require training. So, you know, aligned with that, this is an area of concern. Organizations are having a harder time this year, it appears, to actually keep and sustain that kind of well-qualified staff. So whether it's the years of experience or the training, this is an area where we want to see some improvement. The last one I'll point out here is the disconnect between grantee needs and agency priorities has also gone up a little bit. And this is a question that we'd like to ask, why does that occur? Why would there be a disconnect more this year than others? This is definitely a topic we'd like to dive into. Next slide, please. If we look at what are the success factors now that help organizations in managing grants, you'll see overwhelmingly that well-qualified staff is the #1 by a huge margin. That means over 75% said that was one of the top 3 things that helped their success. Not requiring training and then sustaining the staff is going to have an impact on this. So this is an area where you know, where we want to make sure that we address the concern so that we are able to see our grants programs do well. The second one I'll point out here is effective training and technical assistance. We've heard multiple times from recipients that has a big impact on recipients being able to manage, monitor, and hone in on their grant services before. And not surprisingly, our survey responds with that data as well. And then the last one I'll point out here is the clear communication about mission of grants. We've seen improvements on that in other areas where we've seen the federal government provide more information upfront in the notice of funding or the opportunity announcements. Right up front, the recipients are aware of what the priorities are, what the mission is, and that then follows through as they actually achieve the award and then go on and provide that service. Okay. With that, I will hand it back to you, Jeff, to take us home.
Thank you. Can we advance to the next slide, Ashley? So the open response items that came back from survey respondents are kind of presented in word cloud here. You can see system, training, processes, data, and improvement, kind of better, are the key pieces. On the following slide, the takeaways are kind of the same ones that I highlighted to begin with. If you advance one slide, please, Ashley. And those include that administrative spending increased, lots of time spent on monitoring compliance, performance is not necessarily improving or is not known, and the other items that we've kind of hit on. I do want to use on the following slide, though, some of the open-ended responses, and I'd like to highlight a couple of them because I think they're really good. If you can advance one more slide, please, Ashley. These were just kind of individual responses in a free text format, and I want to highlight a couple. One is a call for simplification. Things are getting pretty complicated, and it tends to be kind of as we just add topics on with respect to a number of different regulations and policies and so forth, they just tend to get more and more complicated. It may be time to step back and think about ways to simplify. It's also, I think, and perhaps consistent with that, there's a suggestion that's the second bullet from the last on the left that suggests consistent processes, perhaps across multiple grant makers, would be really helpful, especially for a grant recipient that's working with several grant makers and several programs. I think that would require some sort of coordinating effort from senior levels in the federal government. So that's something that I think was an interesting idea to me. And the last I think I want to kind of highlight is an idea about bringing in more diverse stakeholders. This is the last bullet on the left. And thinking about kind of the same as we do in technology, thinking about how can we be more customer-centric, make this more beneficial and more useful to both grant recipients and eventually beneficiaries. Then if you look at the final slide here, these are suggestions for priorities for improvement. And I think kind of one of the big topics here clearly is the kind of ways to be able to reduce burden and help be all of us more accountable for funding, but do so without pulling so much time or effort away from grantees. And frankly, kind of closing the loop with some of my initial remarks, let's try not to pull the folks at NASA away from the Mars rover and scientific success. Let's not try to pull the folks from USAID away from combating malaria and from fighting COVID in the US, frankly. Let's see whether or not there are things that we can do, which is what we're being asked by the respondents to this survey, to help make it clearer and easier to be a grant recipient and to achieve program purposes. The last thing that I want to kind of remark on, and this has to do with that diversity topic that's kind of the top one at the left here, is, you know, the circumstances throughout the country during the middle of 2020 made clear in my mind that diversity is a topic our government needs to address. And that may well mean in terms of as well thinking about who is kind of helping not only set our grant policy, but also who is helping in fact, kind of be on our review panels for merit-based grants. So kind of diversity may be an important issue for grant management, just as it is for the rest of government. So with that, what we'll do is invite our panelists to join, ask them to each kind of give a brief self-introduction, and we'll kind of go back through, and on a number of different slides, we have some questions that I've kind of hinted at to pose to the panelists. The panelists have kindly kind of prepped themselves to be able to think about those questions for a couple of weeks now to add to the discussion. And we'll kind of filter in a number of the questions that you've already begun asking in the question box on GoToWebinar. So panelists, if you could please turn on your webcams and join us, then we can start the round of introductions. I guess just from my left to right, maybe start with you, Craig, and then Andrew, and then Eric, and then LaShawn, and then Blanca.
Sure, great. Hi, everybody, and thanks again for inviting me here to talk about what we're doing in the areas of blockchain and grants management. My name is Craig Fisher. I'm with the Bureau of the Fiscal Service within the U.S. Department of Treasury. We are working with, and we have partnered with the National Science Foundation and several universities to see if we could use and leverage blockchain technology to really aim at reducing that reporting burden that we've been talking so much about here today. So I look forward to talking about that here today and some answering any sort of questions that you have.
Andrew?
Hello, my name is Andrew Goldschmidt. I'm the Executive Director with the National Grants Management Association. I've started back in December of 2019, and we'll talk a little bit here in a bit about training and some of the other issues that came up with the survey. It's my pleasure to be with such an esteemed panel today, but I'm a longtime association management executive and also worked around grants for many years, and really excited. We've had really exciting times at National Grants Management Association, and addressing some of these issues that come up with the survey is certainly our goal. So my pleasure to be here. I'll turn it over to our Vice President, Eric. Thank you.
Well, good morning, folks. Happy to be here with you. I'm Eric Russell. I'm a senior manager with Crow LLP, and I'm also vice president of the NGMA, so happy to be here with everyone. Full-time, I'm a grants consultant, and I also divide my time with audit as well. So I work on the single audit, the OIG audit side of the house, but I also have the pleasure of working with a number of organizations to implement new grant programs and also to prepare for audit activities. So regulatory compliance is the majority of my life these days. Looking forward to having some good discussions today. LaShawn, you're next. Yep, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, I was on mute. I was ready. Good morning. My name is LaShawn Henderson, and I'm the Director of Grant Compliance with Valencia College, and that's a community college in Orlando, Florida, warm and sunny Orlando, Florida. And I oversee post-award administration for the college and make sure that we're compliant. I work with our project directors, as we call them, who have the day-to-day operations of the grant, and I make sure that we are making sure we're compliant with our terms of our grant. And I think Blanca's next.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. My name is Blanca Rodriguez, and I'm with the U.S. Department of Education, a senior policy analyst. I have over 25 years experience in grants policy and grants management, and have worked on various programs at the department, including student financial aid and these TRIO programs, Student Support Services, Ronald McNair. And then went into financial management with the Office of the Chief Financial Officer, and now am working on financial management and policy related to grants management. I look forward to our discussion. I think it's going to be exciting. The topics are really relevant, And I'm looking forward to your input. Thank you.
Great. So why don't we start with slide 7, and this is, surprise, surprise, the administrative compliance topic. The question I want to ask is it a problem that we're spending so much time on administrative compliance? And if so, what could grantors or grant recipients do to reduce that burden and that amount of time that's needed for that?
Yeah, I can kick this one off. So as I mentioned, we are working with the National Science Foundation and several universities to sort of explore whether or not blockchain technology is something that could alleviate some of this burden. And really what we found is that yes, compliance is a big problem. I think some of the things, the research that we did, universities are submitting about 400 reports per year. They're submitting 350 quarterly reports every quarter. One of the things that we found is that universities are spending about roughly 8 FTEs, spending roughly about 1,300 hours on reporting. So yes, this is something where, and I think Jeff, you mentioned it, where we're trying to figure out how can we move away from some of these administrative tasks more towards the mission. And I guess what I would say is like, what can grantors and grant recipients do? One thing that I would sort of say is like, let's be open to changing the paradigm for how we do things today, where we might be able to leverage and explore using new technologies like artificial intelligence or blockchain technology that could potentially really reduce that amount of reporting. So from an innovation perspective, this is kind of what I'm looking for to see how could we actually solve these problems, reduce that reporting burden, looking towards new and emerging technology that could actually help this. But I think Eric also had sort of a perspective on this as well.
I don't know if I'd call it a good perspective, but I have a different perspective. So I agree with what Craig mentioned, but I look at it somewhat from the preparation standpoint. It's kind of like how we advise our new auditors, right? The more time that you spend collaborating up front and planning on an audit, the better and the smoother it is on the back end of that engagement, right? The same is true from a grants perspective. So when I started my career, I was helping to implement grants. And when we spent time training, doing technical assistance, making sure that our subrecipients and others and our internal administrators were prepared and knew how to comply with the requirements, the administrative burden and that time that was spent later was much more controlled. So I think if we can somewhat focus and start to really drill home that technical assistance component and the investment in training and utilization of systems, you have less recreation and reinvention of the wheel. We have less time that's required to assemble data for reporting and things of that nature, which we'll talk a little bit more about in the administrative cost section. But I think the upfront investment is really where a significant portion of this is, especially in the COVID environment, when we're teaching new people or we're asking folk to multitask. And there are budget team members that are working on rental assistance and so forth and so on. It's just a new world right now that we're trying to manage remotely. So you definitely have to take a different perspective and relook at the paradigm.
Great, thanks. And I'll put in a quick plug. I've found that there are challenges because a lot of grant managers work in different geographies on different programs. Sharing ideas with each other is not always easy. There are a couple of tools. In fact, I think one is the NGMA's website has an opportunity kind of for a bulletin board to ask questions and share ideas with each other, and kind of as well some training improvement opportunities. Also, I think clearly, some federal agencies do a good job, and in fact, a great job with technical assistance, and there may be some value in sharing ideas with each other. Let me ask any of the panelists, I wonder whether or not the administrative burden topic has really changed much with COVID. Is there more burden or less burden with telework, more burden or less burden with COVID-specific grants? Does anybody have a perspective on that?
Well, I think, LaShawn, go ahead.
No, I know we're done. Well, no, thank you. What I was going to say, I think the administrative burden is different. I think you have more opportunities for funding, and I think it comes from, like Eric talking about, technical assistance on the beginning. So you have so much money, especially for Valencia, the amount of money we're getting and the amount of projects that are able to apply to that funding, I think is so widespread. So I think the administrative burden is different. So it's not just about reporting, it's about the compliance of it and making sure that everything is allowable and meets the requirements. So I think it's a little different because the reporting is what you get once a quarter and annually, but also the nuances of like the clear nexus. So align, trying to figure out what clear nexus is to COVID. So I think it's just a little bit different with the CARES funds.
Yeah, I think that I certainly agree with LaShawn. The other different aspect is to look at it, from the federal perspective, is the repurposing of much of the funds and working with states and project directors at the local level to help them to understand how funds could be expended under the COVID setting. There was a disruption of grants management as we understand it, and as we have seen it operate in schools and in institutions of higher ed at the state level. And it was very sudden. And we found ourselves teleworking. Students were no longer in the classrooms. Teachers had to prepare their own classes online. So there was a major repurposing of funds. And for that reason, there was a lot of collaboration with, program officers at the Department of Ed. The department spent time developing policy that would align with OMB flexibilities, implementing that policy, making sure the policy got to the right staff in the state and the local levels and nonprofits. So yeah, I understand there would be a lot of extra time spent on administration, not only for reporting, but also for trying to understand what the policy implication would be for the way we would manage our grants.
Great. We have a question from one of the participants. Sandra Starnes says, do you think we are trying to collect too much information and not enough actionable information? And that brings back to kind of my point about user centricity. Do we stop and look at all the information we collect and notice that, hey, these 20% of it we never use? We collect it, but we just don't use it. So let's go back and figure out whether we really need to collect it. Does anybody have a thought to answer Sandra's question about collecting information but not really actionable information?
Yeah, we have at the department the same comment on surveys that we have conducted related to performance reporting. And LaShawn and I were going to discuss this in the section on performance, but it applies here as well. And not only is it actionable information, but we know that many of our grantees want to have responses on how does the agency use the data. So we are collecting it. We have timelines on the collection of the data, but we have very little response or feedback to our grantees on how we use that information. And then, is it the right information to be collected? So yeah, no, it is an issue that we are fully cognizant of at the department level and have heard it on a number of occasions. But thank you for the comment.
Blanca, can that be addressed at the individual department level sufficiently, or is there a need for broader coordination across government?
Yeah, there's certainly a need for broader coordination across government, because not only are we looking at collecting performance data, but financial data. And so we have to address the question of standardizing, streamlining, formatting, and certainly technology, Craig, as you have mentioned, plays a significant role in this. And, OMB, I know, is working with agencies trying to address this. The issue of modernization of technology and grants management at that level is something that plays a very significant and very relevant for this topic.
Thanks. So let's then move to the training topic, which is slide 8. And the question here is, we've got a tremendous high value on well-qualified staff, but we don't have very many organizations that call for a training, or that require, even fewer that require certification. Is that a problem? Should there be training requirements or certification? Andrew, do you want to take the lead for us?
Yeah, this is a very timely topic as our executive committee and our board is going through a strategic goal setting process. But certainly NGMA and our partners, we're here to deliver on this particular item. I do admit that the gray area did shock me a little bit. I must say it was a little bit eye-opening. Of course, we're here to service that, and certainly our goal at NGMA is the foundational learning and really getting the hot topics out there so people can have the best practices. So, but I guess maybe it's an awareness issue, and we're also talking about that internally as well. Grants management, it's quite a profession. I mean, I like it to association management, which I've done for more than 25 years as well. There's no degree in it, you know, but it's also very extensive. You need to have a lot of knowledge. You need to wear a lot of different hats, know a lot of different subject matter areas. And so it really is one of those things where I'm surprised people don't back up the ongoing training. I wish they would more. And so maybe it's a awareness and respect issue that we need to address. But that said, I think that we're doing a good job. I mean, we've grown a lot over the past year at NGMA. Our membership has grown significantly. We've grown a lot of our portfolio of training programs and our partners in conjunction with our partners as well. So we're here to address this, but certainly it was a little bit eye-opening, I have to admit, to see the gray area here on this graph. But Eric, you could comment as well if you'd like and add some context.
Sure, I'll just add something quickly. I wasn't overly surprised with the training not being required, just given financial constraints in 2020 and when the survey was rendered. But we have had challenges over the years with organizations being able to make available training over time. And grants management, as Andrew mentioned, is very multidisciplinary, which is one of the exciting things about the industry, but it's also one of the biggest challenges that we have, is that there is no single credential or certification that's going to apply universally to everyone. You've got financial professionals, legal professionals, you've got programmatic personnel that we work with every day from USAID and other agencies, right, that we need them to be specialists in their specific arena. So I don't know if a blanket requirement is the way to address it, but it certainly makes sense to invest and to encourage that recipients are providing and making available training. And in turn, our obligation really to not only our NGMA members, but to the profession overall, is to help organizations, recipients, and subrecipients who are new to the field understand how they can get recovery for some of that grant-specific training and make it more affordable. At the end of the day, the more and the better training that they have, the better the product is that they're able to provide to the government and to assist with executing those program objectives. So I think it's certainly an area to focus on looking forward, and one that I would anticipate and expect growth in.
Let me ask you off the cuff, Eric. As a CPA, you have to have a certain number of hours of training annually in order to keep your certificate as a certified public accountant. Should grant managers have a similar kind of requirement for training? Not necessarily what, but a certain amount?
So I work for a CPA firm, but I'm actually on the regulatory side. So I focus on internal audit and regulatory compliance. Just have to put that out there. I'm not a CPA. I'm many other things, but not a CPA. But yes, you are correct that even regardless of our field in the public accounting industry and which silo we sit in, we do have a certain number of required continuing professional education hours. And I do think it would be valuable to have such a requirement or expectation within the grants field. The devil's in the details, right, Jeff, is what field is that in and how do we monitor and enforce it, given the multidisciplinary nature of the industry. So right there with you on the theoretical and conceptual thinking.
And I will add, Jeff, that we have a certified grants management specialist program. It does require ongoing education. So, and I know there's other ones out there, obviously, for other other parts of the profession, but it's worth discussing. I mean, certainly, you don't want to mandate it, to Eric's point, but certainly it could be highly encouraged. And training can be folded into a grant. It depends on your policies and procedures of your organization. But that's another option too that can actually be built into the grant itself, where we're allowable per policies and procedures. So maybe the awareness of that particular factor too may not be as high as it should be. So getting it out there is important.
And I'll add, if I could, as a grantee, as a non-federal entity, one of the things that we do is I train the project directors internally so that they have training as they manage their grant and as they implement their grant. So they're not having no training. So there is a responsibility I think there should be some responsibility on the grantee also to train those people that are going to be managing the grant, because we accept the award with all of these assurances that we will. So it's in some way making sure that as you accept it, there's some procedures in place, that there's some training and some resources internally.
And I want to add that, you know, the training has to cascade. You're right, LaShawn. And we at the department, I'm in the grants policy and training division at the department. We train staff at the department in grants policy and grants management. And we develop also webinars that we are posting on the department's website so that our grantees can access. The topics range from cash management to administrative policy. And, you know, I certainly recommend everybody to visit our website to participate in those webinars.
Great. And one remark I'll make just for the whole audience is we will share the slides with you all after the fact so that you don't need to worry about taking quick notes and if others, for example, Blanca or whomever has some suggestions about helpful links, we're happy to include those in our communication as well. Let's move to slide 11. And this is the topic again that I was surprised by, which is administrative spending seems to have gone up and in fact pretty substantially. And so the question here is, Eric or Blanca, why do you think administrative spend has increased? And is this even more surprising since COVID assistance has substantially increased the amount of grant spending overall by government at this point?
Would you like to go first?
Go ahead, Eric. Go ahead.
No, would you like to go first?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I was not overly surprised. I usually look at these questions and one item that comes to my mind is when each person reads administrative, are they understanding and defining administrative in the same way? So one instance or issue that we run across often in the audit space and in the programmatic field as well is some confusion between indirect costs and administrative expenses. From that perspective, to see an increase, I would expect it as we move to a remote work environment, but there are also a number of programs that are either prohibiting indirect cost recovery or have otherwise capped or limited the amount of an award that can be expended on indirect cost. So you're seeing more and more efforts to shift to a direct charge of administrative expenses, assuming that the difference between the two is clear to our members and to those responding. So that's an area that I've seen quite a bit of. The other piece is, frankly, with respect to errors. So with new programs, there are always errors, right? That's natural as part of the growth and the maturity of a program, but it requires more time from your administrative staff to address audit findings. That's internal and external audit findings, federal monitoring reports, development, design, and setup of programs. So there's just more administrative work that's required to get programs off the ground. So I wasn't overly surprised by this, but I'm certainly, in a purely a priori sense, I would anticipate and expect that a portion of this increase is probably due to some double overlap between indirect expenses and administrative costs and that understanding of the difference. Blanca, what do you think?
I certainly, yes, I agree. And, you know, I go back to the issue that I mentioned earlier about repurposing and new policy. The other is the requirements under the uniform guidance. There is reporting, not only performance reporting, but also the FAFATA changes that requiring the subaward reporting on compensation and executive total compensation for subawards. And that is the prime recipient having to coordinate with all of the subawards and obtaining information from the subawards that has to be posted in FSR, Federal Financial Reporting, and also in SAM. And I think that that's a lot of new reporting systems that have to be learned and have to be accessed. And there's the issue of making sure that the formatting of the information that is being reported is accurate, and making sure that you have staff at the federal side available to help with the contract with the prime grantee and to ensure that the information is being submitted accurately. So it's the issue of the reporting and for performance and financial. There's also the policy related to the 10% de minimis rate. So, you know, grantees now have the option to take a 10% de minimis rate, but that doesn't mean then that institutions of higher ed have to continue with the 8% rate for training. related to training. But, you know, it's various changes that have occurred related to the uniform guidance that affect both direct and indirect costs. And I think that it's taking time for our grantees to sort of align with that new thinking that's being put out in the field.
You know, I wonder one other piece, and you know, Jeff and Craig, I'm interested to hear what you two think about this too. Is there's been, at least I saw it quite a bit in 2020, just some resistance or hesitation to invest in software solutions to help manage and make the grants management side more efficient. The trade-off, of course, is if you don't invest in a software solution or an IT type enhancement, then you're going to require more man hours. So to the point that was being made earlier, you've got a lot more emails, a lot more manual effort that's meant to pull the data together. Ergo, we see a lot more errors in the reports that are submitted, which requires even more time investment. So it's kind of you're weighing 6 in one hand, half dozen in the other, right? In terms of whether you make the investment on the front end or the back end. Either way, if you can make that one-time investment, it seems to benefit grantees more in terms of efficiency and reducing some of the long-term administrative expense. But I don't know what you all think.
Actually, I want to share something that we're kind of working on, but it's not really ready for prime time, which is we've got some information about agencies that have a relatively low proportion of their grant value that's administrative spending, and others that have a quite a bit higher. And we're trying to do some kind of reconciliation as to what's common or perhaps different between the two. We are finding tentatively, and again, without a good representative sample and not really scientific experimentation, but we're finding that the folks who spend more on technology are achieving a lower administrative spend rate. You know, we can't say that confidently yet. That's something that we think probably necessitates a more careful study with some kind of serious apples to apples accounting as opposed to just kind of self-reporting. But I do kind of wonder as well, you know, Craig, I have this image in my mind with blockchain that it will kind of help us magically see where the money eventually ends up, and will give us, especially in combination with the Data Act, an ability to say, you know, at least perhaps on a pilot basis, you know, we've been able to figure out where the money's going for administrative spend, and you know, we can do that on an apples to apples basis with the Data Act categories. Am I really just smoking something and hoping for something that's never going to happen, or is that actually within the realm of possibility of what you see with the work that you're doing at Treasury?
Well, you're not smoking anything. I assure you. Like, this is something that we are trying. You know, you hit the nail on the head. Like, this is what we're trying to do. I think what we're specifically trying to do with NSF and some of the university partners is that what we're finding is that a lot of the reporting burden is due to the lack of transparency, the lack of that funding transparency, especially when there's a prime to sub relationship. Because this is occurring, these money transfers are occurring with the ACH network and banks taking out of a prime recipient's bank account and putting it into the sub-recipient's bank account. The federal government does not see those transactions. Therefore, we ask for a great deal of reporting to come back from us to say, where did these funds go? What we're trying to do with blockchain technology is that we're trying to alleviate some of that lack of transparency. One of the things that blockchain technology is really good at is sort of near real-time transactional transparency. So one of the things that we're doing is we're trying to understand is if through this idea of tokenization, and really what tokenization is really you're just representing something of value instead of actually transferring that value. You're transferring that representation of value through what's called a blockchain token. You can kind of think of it like if you go to a casino or like Chuck E. Cheese, you get like a token. You don't actually pay with the actual money. You actually pay the token. But think of it as these tokens being loaded with all of that money, that payment information, along with the grant information. And as that information is changing hands from participant to participant, we get that notification in real time. Therefore, we can reduce a lot of that reporting. So, for example, one of the things that we learned through using tokenization and blockchain is that we were able to largely eliminate a reporting SF 425, if that's something that you all do. We can largely eliminate that just from actually loading this information onto the blockchain and through tokenization. So Jeff, now this is exactly what we're trying to do. However, blockchain technology is going to present a lot of other challenges. There's a lot of, you're effectively would be onboarding, you know, like what, 50,000 different prime recipients, a lot more sub-recipients kind of onto a similar platform, that's going to present a lot of challenges, a lot of cultural challenges. So a lot of paradigm shifting. I see that there's a lot of upside to this, but it is going to take more time for us to fully sort of flesh this out.
I think it would be really fascinating, and I'll just make the request now, if Craig, you could come back to one of our breakfast forums and talk a little more in detail, because I can think of two immediate questions that a lot of folks in the audience might have, such as, does this mean everybody in this whole audience has to buy a new system? And does everybody need to be trained and understand blockchain, or are these not really necessary?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And actually, you just made a great plug for me right now. So in the chat, we're actually going to put the blockchain application that we did build. It's a URL that you can go to and you can check it out. There's a little bit of a little password that we'll also include in there as well. But what we found ourselves giving demo, where we were going in and actually having to schedule time to showcase what we were trying to build. So what we did is we just basically created a URL that you can take a self-guided tour of the application. We are starting small, we are starting simple. We have not built this to be a sort of production grade blockchain application for grants, but it's a start. And it's something that where if we could use, this form and others to really pressure test this idea to see what's working and what's not working, we want everybody to sort of be part of the solution. Blockchain is a team effort, we're finding, so a lot of other people are going to come in here to give their insights. So hopefully that can get in the chat and you can all scrape it off and check it out. But yes, Jeff, I'd love to come back at another forum to talk more about this.
That would be terrific, and I'll commit here now that we'll make sure that to take that from the chat and get that to you all as a follow-up email along with the slides, so that you don't necessarily have to just write it down instantly. So let's move on then to the performance management topic, which is going to be, I believe, these are too small for me to see, slide 16, I think it is, Ashley, if you could advance to the performance management topic. And the question here is kind of partly around the COVID pandemic and around performance as well. I wonder, Blanca or LaShawn, can you tell us, has the pandemic affected performance for your organizations or beneficiaries? Have you tried to make changes in response to the pandemic? And were there any restrictions on your ability to make changes that the changes that you might have thought might be needed?
I want to comment on the first thing that I think it's important is the update to the uniform guidance to CFR related to closeouts, giving grantees additional time or extending the recipient liquidation period immediately. That would be the period after the end date of the performance period, from 90 calendar days to 120 calendar days, giving recipients an opportunity to more time to submit financial and performance data and reports to the department. So that is already in place, and recipients can certainly work with department program officers to take advantage of that. And also our grants management systems have been updated to accommodate that 120-day liquidation period. The other is certainly we found that many of our grantees, they had trouble submitting their performance reports because of the pandemic, and so there was problems with timely submission of data. I'm sure, LaShawn, you have other comments on that?
Oh yeah, we talked for an hour about these, but yeah, I think that yes, like most grants, and I'm speaking from a recipient because that's Valencia College. I think we did have impact, and there were some that were challenging and some that were positive. So I'll start with some of the positives were that because of, the pandemic was not positive in and of itself, but it did allow us to be open to new technologies. Of course, there was the Zoom world and Teams world we knew nothing about. And so in some respects, that was good because for some of our college-wide impact grants, like our Title V's, where it was across the institution, different departments, it allowed better attendance for people to attend meetings and get engaged and involved. So on the one hand, that was a positive, using technology. We started some of that before under the Skype model, but it was just better way to communicate. So that was a positive. At the same time, like Blanca mentioned, some of the challenges were when this time last year, when the pandemic hit, it was a whole shift. We were mostly in-person institution, and we were all of a sudden shifted into this remote world. Students didn't have access necessarily to technology or internet, and faculty and staff like myself did not either necessarily, or internet. So it was a complete shift and even a delay in some of our projects where we had to spend time figuring out what projects were and what the deliverables were and the timeline to be able to know, would we need an extension, which deliverables or which parts of the project would be impacted. So it took some time to figure out that structure first with the project team, and then making sure that people were safe and, and students were safe. So I think one of the impact was just the overall compliance of it, of the grant, just making sure that we knew which projects needed to be extended. And then when you speak about administrative burden, so if you think about like Valencia, we have about 70 grants, I think. I might be a little bit generous on that. So with 70 projects or maybe 50 federal grants, there's 50 reports I have to make and 50 requests to extend and 50 notifications that our reports will be delayed. So when you speak about administrative burden, that's a lot of requests and a lot of asks to make of each, because there's a different project, different program officer. So I think those are the kind of administrative burden aspects that, that we faced. And then when you think about our procedures, communicating with the project staff, making sure that, especially with new CARES funds, you have new project directors that have never managed a federal grant before, having to provide technical assistance to them, and then learning the nuances of CARES layered in within the uniform guidance. So those were some of the impacts that we felt. So while there were some positives naturally, but there was a lot of shift in some systems we had in place, we had to make them different to be able to comply and sustain. And I think one of the other benefits that I'll find is that for us, and don't laugh at us, we had the paper system of time and effort reporting. Don't laugh at us. We had a paper system, and we've been talking about making electronic. That forced us to make it PDF fillable. Still don't laugh at us, but it's a PDF fillable, so it went electronic. But that forced us to change in the pandemic. So there were some opportunities to improve systems, and there definitely was some rethinking of current system and practices. Yeah.
Great. I want to, on this topic, actually offer a shout out. I know there are 3 or 4 folks on this conference from the Health Resources and Services Administration, and for my own ulterior motives, since REI works with HRSA, I carefully looked at what date the CARES Act was passed and which federal agencies began issuing grants following that CARES Act passage. And I found that HRSA was first, which I was very pleased with. But what really astounded me was that they were able to issue the first grants to provide patient care under the CARES Act 12 days after passage of the law. And I think that's just a testament to the outstanding capabilities of the grants management community. I see a question that comes in, I think that's kind of on topic here from a member of the audience. Louise Brady asks, what are the measurement tools of grant success? And when/how many times do these measurement tools get used throughout the life of the grant's lifetime? I'd invite any of our panelists to answer that, but I also will ask explicitly if Andrew perhaps might be willing to make a commitment to offer perhaps a session that gives an overview of performance management tools for grants, because it seems like that's a topic of interest. It doesn't have to happen next month, but perhaps 3 months from now, you could offer a little bit of an overview. And I think that perhaps members of the audience, others like Louise, might have that question. Does anybody want to jump up and answer the question about what are the measurement tools that are being used, and how should they be used continuously over the course of a grant lifetime?
We've had that question asked at the department, and we've had some perceptions from our own grantees. And the grantee perspective is they're looking to the department for agency-wide collaboration on that topic. Yes, the issue of best practices is very important, and our grantees want to hear more information on that, not only best practice related to the specific program they're at, but what best practices are across the entire department. They also are interested in more information on how the department uses data, as I mentioned earlier, but also on not only on best practices for program implementation, but best practices related to evaluation, the measures that are being used in evaluation, models used for accessing and addressing performance outcomes. There is a lot of discussion going on and training going on within department staff on looking for evidence-based best practices and sharing of that information with our grantees. So it's at that level now that the department is moving forward to work with our grantees to make them aware of best practices and the evidence-based act and how that would apply.
And Jeff, I'll take that mantle. Absolutely. We're about 3 or 4 months out on our webinar series. I love the idea. So challenge accepted. It's a great idea for future. And it keeps coming up in these surveys. So it obviously is, everybody wants to prove outcomes, you know, and better measure them. So seeing that people are struggling obviously is, you know, that's our goal, you know, is to help people
Great.
and help them,
And I'm
you know,
sure,
feel better
I'm
about
sure
efficiency.
Kathy Newcomer into providing a forum if need be as well. Let's next move to slide 16, which is the one that kind of addresses the topic about self-reporting versus third-party gathered data. And the question I have here is, should grantors rely exclusively on self-reported data to determine if grantees are achieving program goals? Should the department that makes the grant rely entirely upon the agency that's spending the grant to just be honest and completely forthright? And LaShawn, I'm curious about your perspective as a kind of a grant recipient, and any others, of course, who would like to jump in are welcome to.
I'm sorry, did you want me to start? I thought you.
Go for it, LaShawn.
Okay, so I think there's if I understand the question correctly, I think there is a combination between self-report and data. I mean, you have to have the data to back it up. It's kind of like if you have no documentation back it up, it didn't happen. So there has to be some self-report, because I think the item we talked about, quantifiable and qualifiable. So like a lot of times, some of the unintended outcomes are quality. How, for us, like how did the students engage? Were they participating? Did they get the support services? Did they, stay within their STEM field? Those items are not always necessarily quantifiable, but you can show their engagement, you can show their participation. But I do think there's a level of data that has to be entered to show that certain outcomes were met. So I think it has to be not one or the other, but a combination.
Great.
And I think we already touched on the point of data quality. It's in order for us to have information that we can share and be transparent, the assumption is that we have controls in place for the submission of data and the quality of the data that's being submitted. When you have a lot of new recipients, even basic things like maybe the lack of a 4-digit add-on to the zip code may totally discombobulate your submission. As a part of transparency, many of the congressmen want to know how much money their districts are getting, and we need that +4 zip code in order to be able to address that. And so you look at, what is the congressional intent, and how does that congressional intent then translate into the data that's being collected? And I think there's often a misconnection on that. And we do a poor job maybe of explaining to our grantees, many of these data requirements are part of the authorization and part of the legislation that's and the congressional intent.
And sometimes you don't know the difference between the two. So that would be clearer and helpful for us.
Yeah, that would be important. Even just the small little thing of the zip code is important.
Yeah, because oftentimes we're reporting on the outcomes in the proposal we submitted, right? And then oftentimes there are legislative intent, like I'm thinking about actually the APR for Department of Education. There's some outcomes that are just reported because of the Title V program, and those aligned kind of, but to understand the alignment of the two would be helpful because they're often a set aside from what we're, we said we would do this and we would increase the, engagement 10% or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
So the important thing is to make sure that our measures and the data is being collected addresses the mission and the intent of Congress. And that's all the Department of Ed is implementing and asking our grantees when they respond to the data measures in the APR.
Great. Let's move to slide 18, and these are the topics about which the respondents felt most strongly. The first one I want to touch on here is data sharing. And so the question kind of is, what data should be shared? How? Is it possible to do so without kind of increasing burden? And it seems to me like, Craig, you're in perhaps a good position to answer this, although certainly others are welcome to jump in.
Yeah, so the way I would view something like this and kind of what we're learning is that, something like blockchain technology is probably, it could be a good mechanism by which you share information. However, getting to some of the more, if you sort of unpack that question a bit more, I think you have to sort of like understand like what does each one of the stakeholders need to just sort of drive value for their respective organizations. So I do think, going back to one of the things that Blanca had mentioned, yes, blockchain, great mechanism to share it, but you'll have to agree on what to share, like what to load up on within that system to add value for your organization. So I think that data standardization is going to be a really important key to sharing data. You have to agree on what's important for folks. Even from what we're finding now too, we are building this blockchain application with NSF, with their university partners. But as we expand that out to, let's say, Department of Education or with HHS, you all may have different data that's important to your agencies for whatever reason. So there's a larger sort of data standardization effort, I think, that would have to take place in order to sort of like drive value for each one of the stakeholders within that network. But I would like to hear what other folks had to think about that.
Anybody else want to jump in?
Just to contribute, at the department, you are right. We, similar to the work you're doing with NSF, we do have in place work with a contractor to help with the formatting and standardization of the Department of Ed APR. Hopefully, we'll be sharing that in the next year or following. But we have been working with our program staff and grantees, pilot groups, to look at launching a performance report that is streamlined, more easier to submit, and with better instructions, and hopefully easier for our grantees to use.
Great. Let's move on to the analytics topic, which I believe should be the next slide, if you can advance one, Ashley. And the question here is, it's interesting to me because I'm really a kind of an analytics wonk, but some, not all executives though, are interested in analytics. And so the question is kind of, what are the most valuable types of analysis or that you found, and kind of for what purposes? And I wonder either Blanca or perhaps Eric can respond to that. Actually, I guess this one is for you, Blanca. The next one is for Eric.
Eric, you want to go first?
Sure. I think, well, I wasn't overly surprised with the responses here, but I think it's what I found to be most interesting behind the scenes, whether you're in board meetings or otherwise with grantees, is the executives don't always know what to ask in order to be invested in the analytics. So I think part of the challenge or the focus that we have to talk through is what's important, as Blanca mentioned, from the legislative and congressional intent perspective, so that the grant recipients know what to monitor and what to contribute, and then in turn what to share with those that are in executive leadership to keep them interested and understand how to use the information. So I've seen that to be a key area of focus, is helping them to understand what's needed to provide adequate oversight and governance of the programs. I don't know, Blanca, if you had a different thought in terms of the use or development of those analytics.
No, I certainly agree. I just want to add, at the department, we do have a grantee satisfaction survey. that we've been conducting for the past 15 years. And most recently, we've been working with department leadership and senior management council and making presentations to senior leaders on the results of the 2020 grantee satisfaction survey, covering topics related to monitoring, technical assistance, performance reports, coordination across staff, the use of online resources. And so we are sharing with our management the results and the grantee perceptions on those measures and the attributes associated with those measures. I know that many of our program staff and leadership are very interested in using some of that information for program improvement and also for best practices. So I know leadership is very, very interested in the use of data. We use data also for our grants tracking, grants management activity in the department, both pre-award as well as post-award, and all of the activity associated with from the time that the funding opportunity is posted in the Federal Register, all the way to the time that the award is made, and how many awards are made associated with that CFDA or that financial assistance number, and the amount of money that's also associated with each award. All of that is part of our grants management system and information used by leadership.
And I think that's awesome. And one of the, at the federal level, WACA's team has a system that's monitoring each of their recipients. On the next level, just with respect to prime and then subrecipient relationships, one of the big challenges that we've hit from a risk perspective and the ability to contribute or provide data is that there's been such a focus on using single audit results to provide the data that flows into some of the analytics. But you look at 2020, you've got a whole host of entities that have either never been subject to single audit, they didn't have enough money or expenditures, or and as a result, they're not providing or contributing through that standard cycle a single audit report to pull the data from. So you've got an incomplete data set that you're trying to draw conclusions and analytics on, which in turn leaves your executives a bit blind to arguably one of the much higher risk components of the portfolio, which are those smaller municipalities and nonprofit organizations that all of a sudden have well over $750,000 from blanket payroll reimbursement from CRF, or something of that nature. So depending on your agency and then in turn who your subrecipients are that are being funded by that activity, your whole risk models change, and the ability to draw conclusions and to evaluate and analyze that data is potentially at risk as well to provide adequate monitoring. So love the use of systems, but the challenge is always, right, that the data going in has to be complete and valid.
So, and I want to add to that entity risk assessment is a component of new awards. Mm-hmm. And so it's very important for continued funding and continued federal support. I'm sure this is across all federal agencies, that the single audits be addressed, and that the audit data be submitted, and that whatever elements are in SAM related to risk be reviewed on an ongoing basis by the grantee to make sure that they're not being penalized for incorrect information in a federal system.
Right.
I want to ask Eric, there's been a relative dissatisfaction with technology and as well ability to afford it. So the question is kind of what should be done about this? And I'm asking you in particular, Eric, because a bunch of folks who have put in questions have said, I'm looking for new technology, what do you suggest? Or my organization's about to purchase something and I'm afraid maybe if blockchain's going to change everything, should I maybe not purchase it right away? I have a kind of a sense several of the different questioners from local governments or nonprofits kind of would like the federal government to pay, but I'm not sure. So I'm not going to ask any of the federal representatives on the panel. I'm going to ask you, Eric, And similarly, I can't answer the question because I have a stake in the game. My company sells technology solutions to help manage grants. So my question is for you, Eric, how should technology be provided for grant management? Should the federal government play a different role than it's been playing?
Good question, and I guess I'll take it in two steps. One is, well, and we also provide software, so I have to answer very generally without advocating in any way. But I think the first is with respect to should organizations look at technology and what's causing some of that dissatisfaction. I think in the field, what I've often seen is limitations in technology due to requirements issues. So an organization will assume that a software that's coming, off the shelf at the price point that they may be looking for will provide the information they need to manage the grant. I have found that to not always be true, and which presents additional risk in terms of accuracy, completeness of reporting, and the ability to meet what LaShawn and Blanca mentioned in terms of required outcome reporting. So the requirements themselves are often not designed or assembled and gathered in a manner that provides for the receiving organization, that customer, to get what they need in order to be satisfied. So I think that's really the first and probably the most significant component, is making sure that you as a procuring official are involved in that requirements gathering conversation. And frankly, that as grants managers, we have a seat at the table. So a big challenge that we do run into is I shouldn't say we, what I've seen is oftentimes individuals and departments will delegate that procurement effort to an IT department or to central finance, who's looking at it from a completely different perspective. We're not in the grant space as concerned with accounts payable and accounts receivable components and the integration with the general ledger, right? We're looking at what's an eligible expenditure flowing through to the FFR and the unliquidated obligations. That's the kind of stuff we're looking for. Different perspective altogether. So requirements gathering, collaboration on the front end, well, should help you to get where you're going. And I think the dissatisfaction with the ability to get the data in a format that they need it in due to that gap in requirements is really leading to some of that information. You also asked about the cost and the federal government's role. I don't really have a perspective either way on the federal government's role in terms of advising what may need to be included in software systems. But I think from a risk standpoint, and putting my risk management hat on, the government provides guidance and restrictions in terms of what best practices are, and the expectation under the 200.303 requirement that sensitive data be protected. Beyond that, they've really delegated to recipients, subrecipients, so forth and so on, the expectation that you make that decision from a management perspective. So the government's not mandating the types of software. So I don't think it necessarily makes practical sense for the government to come in and provide that type of expectation or requirement, understanding the resources from entity to entity are so different. But I do think it would make some sense from, I'd say, probably an indirect cost perspective. If you've got 70 awards or so, as LaShawn mentioned, and you procure a grants management solution to help the government get the type of reporting it needs, then it would make sense to talk with your cognizant agency to see if that's a cost that they would not object to having included in the indirect cost pool. There's very clearly a benefit to the grants from a subpart E perspective that would make a portion of that cost allocable. And it may be a good conversation starter to help offset some of the economic disincentive.
Sure.
So those are, I'll get off my.
I might add, Jeff. Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I remember from last year, there was a lot of discussion about misunderstandings about security. So people wanted to procure, and then, does the agency accept our security level? And that's probably a real hot topic right now, and always has been, but even more so in recent months. So I think that's something where the Fed can step in, is to help define the security parameters, and then that helps build confidence with folks choosing a system. And my 2 cents, if it might be. Yeah.
But also we need something standardized also, right? Because for every grantor, there's different reporting and requirements. So even as a grantee, trying to look at some sort of technology, I might find something, and it's, of course, having the train to know what we need, and it's grant specific. So having a technology that's general enough that you can fit every grant into the bucket in every funding agency versus something that's very specific for one, but doesn't meet the requirement for another. So it seems like in order to do that well, we'd have to have some standardization of the of the reporting so that we could be able to have a system that manages it. Otherwise, we have one system that fits one grant, but not another.
I think that that's interesting. And looking at the agile components of that software development lifecycle, right? It's just getting back to requirements. Is there's going to be standardization on the financial side typically, but with every Congress, right? Every 2 years, there are new initiatives, new focuses. There are going to be new components and authorizing legislation. So there has to be some flexibility in that software as well. To your point with Sean earlier about what gets reported. So I think that's probably a key component of requirements gathering is what are the current items that you have? And then if you know that there are going to be changes, what can you do yourself, right? And can the provider train you on how to change those outcome measures and what's being collected? Because where folks lose a lot of cash is on change requests with software.
Yes.
It's making those changes. So the more you get done in requirements gathering and user acceptance testing, the much better that software is going to work for you and it's going to meet your needs. So I think that's kind of, getting back to making sure that our grants folk are involved on the front end should help with that concern, I think that Jeff mentioned earlier.
Let me interject with a question from a member of the audience. Deanne Byer, and I'm going to address this to you, Craig. Deanne Byer says, my organization is currently looking at purchasing technology and upgrading within the next 6 to 12 months. I would like to be proactive on this project and would hate to purchase a system and find out later that we missed an opportunity. Can I get a greater understanding or direction about from Craig Fisher about kind of the blockchain opportunity and when that time frame might arise, and whether or not the system I acquire should be whether it'll need specifically to be able to accommodate blockchain as I acquire the system?
Yeah, I would frame it right now as to say that we're clearly in the proof of concept phase at this point. Like we're not even to a point where we're going to start piloting this. We haven't connected the blockchain application to any financial systems at this point to even test the connectivity of it. So I do think 6 to 12 months. You mentioned in the comment, clearly going to be just moving from a proof of concept to a pilot phase. I don't have a magic wand or path that I can pull up the rabbit to say like where we're going to be, but I think with an emerging technology like blockchain, I would be surprised if we had anything 3 to 5 year timeline. And again, I think our perspective is that we want to do this carefully. And one thing I want to be very clear is that Craig Fisher from Treasury is not sitting here being pro blockchain. I think what we're trying to understand is, does blockchain offer value to the federal government? Does it offer value to prime and sub-recipients? We don't really know the answer to that question yet. We are seeing some promise. We are seeing some areas where we think that we could reduce that reporting burden. But as we sort of move from proof of concept to pilot, a lot more questions arise. So for example, we're going to have to deploy digital wallets. Those digital wallets allow those tokens to be transferred from participant to participant. What does even a blockchain ecosystem look like within the federal government? Who hosts those sort of nodes in blockchain speak? What's the risk concerns around that? So there's a lot of things that we're going to have to figure out before this is production ready. But I think what our philosophy is that we want to start challenging some of the paradigms that we currently have, because there is a lot of reporting burden. We want to see what emerging technologies could help, but we do want to slow roll this. This is not going to be a boil the ocean. In 2 years, we're going to be doing this. We want to move slowly, incrementally. So what I would sort of encourage folks to do is just to, pay attention to what we're doing, where we're going, how you can actually get involved with this. We are looking for a lot more stakeholders to sort of get involved with this effort to inform it. I think, Blanca and Eric, we're talking a little bit more about that human-centered design element to what we really are trying to use that. We really want to understand, is this scratching an itch? And if not, let's go back and rethink this. But we really want to sort of get that from the user perspective, which is those grant recipients and subrecipients. So hopefully that sort of alleviated some concerns. But I won't make any recommendations on what to do with your system.
And I don't want to put you on the spot, Craig, but if there's any sort
they're
of,
not alone in that.
every 3 month kind of communication about what the status of this is that you push out to people, and you're able to share that, then we can pass that back to this audience with our follow-up. So I'm going to switch gears. We're going to try and kind of wrap up in the next 10 minutes or so. Let's move to slide 26, and in the kind of the significant challenges and success factors topic area. There was concern over inexperienced grantees. We've got a lot of new grants going out with COVID and a whole bunch of new grantees. You know, the folks who are getting Patient Protection Act money, they think it's a grant, maybe it's a loan, who knows for sure. They've never received a grant before, perhaps. How can the grants community help with new or inexperienced recipients succeed? And I wonder, LaShawn or Blanca, do you have any thoughts or suggestions?
Well, I'll start. Technical assistance is a critical component to meet the mission of a grant, of a program, technical assistance is one of the attributes or one of the measures that we have in our grantee survey, and we feel very positive about the delivery of the technical assistance to our grantees, especially as we work to train our own staff so that they can be effective also. But we did find that our grantees are looking for direct one-on-one technical assistance with program officers. That they really seek and get the most satisfaction out of. They also are feel very positive about the range of webinars and teleconferencing opportunities that we've had with our grantees, especially during this COVID period. And we also see now going forward, a redesign in the way we deliver technical assistance to our grantees and the value of using technology to communicate directly within a larger number of our grantees. In the past, many of our grantees have attended conferences. Oftentimes, only the project director goes to the conference. Using technology, we have a wider sphere then of grantees that we can reach and program participants that we can reach. So we're learning a lot from this experience, and we hope to use that as we engage and improve the quality of our technical assistance.
I agree with that. And I also think that ongoing places to check in with the grantees, not necessarily on paper, but also a way to communicate routinely. Not that we need more meetings, but it actually would be helpful, especially since sometimes within an institution or organization, there's turnover. So who you trained or provided technical assistance in the beginning of the grant is not necessarily who's in the grant, leading the grant as time goes on. And I also think when I was sitting here thinking, when we have what a great place to put resources would be in the award notification, because that's agency specific. So if I have an award with Department of Education, I'm using you, Blanca, since we're teammates. Even though I might know them, if I change over and someone else comes in and picks up the award notice, which naturally everyone typically reads, if you saw resources on this page, maybe that's a way of forcing the project team or the grants manager to go to that site, because I know, go to the website. But sometimes if you are a different layer within Department of Education, you have to know where to go within a website. So I think maybe some information resources within the award notice would be helpful for new grantees, and just what routine check-ins to provide technical assistance and just ongoing support. Because sometimes you don't know what you need until you're in the grant, and then you have a question, and then it's email back and forth.
That's so important, LaShawn. I want to get back to the topic of the grant award notification. It's so important. Oftentimes, a notification only goes to the financial office, and there is no communication between the financial office and the actual program staff. And I think that we do need to bridge that communication. And I think the point you're making is so important. That grant award notification contains valuable information that helps with monitoring, that focuses on specific program requirements and the attachments associated with that. And I think that's very valuable. Thank you so much, LaShawn, for reminding me of that. I think it's awesome.
A really interesting comment, not a question, from audience member Denise Delaney. She says, you know, perhaps rather than insisting every grant manager be certified, maybe there could be kind of one individual per organization that gets a formal certification. Because, for example, and this is casting aspersions, some folks on the panel believe it's easy to interpret federal regulations, but you know, it's actually pretty complicated when you're focused kind of on a local program and you're a nonprofit worker who wears 7 different hats.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Not sure what to do about that, but that seems like a different approach that seems kind of interesting to me.
That's our, at Valencia, that's our structure. So I provide the overall administrative. So I have the certification with, so we have this, I have certification with CGMS under NGMA. So I have the knowledge of the federal guidelines. And then so one of my roles is to make sure that if there's an assigned project director, I would give them that technical assistance. So they have actually, we developed an orientation for project directors where I tell them, like, I don't expect them to know FAFATA. They just won't know that deep. But they will know allowables and unallowables and general information about their grant. And then I'm the person who's supposed to know the regulations. So it doesn't put all the onus on the project director who is trying to implement the project. So our structure is, there's me as the grants manager, then there's an accounting staff person, and then there's a project director. So the 3 of us, I mean, there's other people as well as procurement, but typically that's the structure. So it's, I provide the administrative and programmatic and compliance, there's accounting, and then there's a project to make sure the deliverables and meeting the objectives of the grant. So that is an interesting point that she makes, because that's our structure, and it's more successful that way.
I've seen that work as well, where there's a department or a group that's a centralized grants management unit that's responsible for providing that training. And it's really important, as you know, LaShawn mentioned, that the agreements are shared with the project teams, and we may assume that everyone reads it. In practice, I can tell you that that assumption is not true. Everyone doesn't read the agreement, but more importantly, what we see in the field and in practice is that those who read it don't necessarily know what they're reading.
Correct.
So, you know, we've got flow down provisions, we've got references to, you know, 200.302, 303, 304, what have you. We know what those are, and we know what they mean and why they're important. But to an individual who's focused on implementing a program or providing educational training, they're going out and making sure those with disabilities are receiving the right type of education from a service center or what have you, that's not their focus. So making sure that there are those kickoff meetings, which is kind of what we advise our clients to do, is to have formal kickoffs whenever we get a new grant, is to help bridge that gap for these new individuals and those that are, frankly, in the current economic time, wearing 3 or 4 different program hats. So they're not specializing in any one single area, but they're trying to help move 3 or 4 different initiatives forward. So that initial training and development for new managers or new grant administrators is going to be really, really important over the next couple of years.
And you know what else, Eric? It helps with continuity across grants, because if you think about it, if every project director is implementing the regulations their own way, then that becomes, you know, like you said, 200-303. If, you know, program director X is implementing that regulation this way, and program director Y is implementing, so then as an institution or organization, there's no continuity of how grants are managed. It's just that grant versus this grant. And you're right, the project directors read the ones that we work with, they read the board notice, but they have no idea. I'm gonna go back to FAFATA. They have no idea what that means. They're like, what is this FAFATA thing? Like, they don't know what that means, and they're implementing the project. And is it their, I mean, I guess it is their responsibility, but is it though for cross project to make sure that they're doing that level and have that training? So we take that onus off of them and put it in another position that is charged with and has responsibility to know what those elements are.
Let me ask if we can move, getting closer to closure, to slide 29, which is kind of the key takeaways. And at the top right of the slide, the indication is 78% of survey respondents said the pandemic affected their grant outcomes. And so my question for you panelists, anybody can answer who would like to, what steps can or should grant managers take now to be ready for a new normal post-pandemic? Maybe it's telelearning, maybe it's site visits, maybe it's technical assistance. What do you think folks should do to be ready for the kind of the new normal after hopefully folks have been vaccinated and the pandemic's under control?
Well, certainly an on-site monitoring review is by far the best option for collaboration with the program staff as well as the grantee. It's a learning experience all the way around for everybody. We have, and during the pandemic, learned a lot from our virtual on-site monitoring. Virtual monitoring, it's not a virtual monitoring, and we're working on taking steps to improve our approach to virtual monitoring. So, that's a takeaway. We may use that much more often than we have in the past.
I think backfilling and training others. One item that really has come to light, but just really across the board, is when individuals get sick, there just tends to be no one to take their place or that knows what they were doing and how to do it. So when someone goes out suddenly for 2 weeks with COVID, they need to quarantine or what have you, there just aren't individuals adequately trained to fill that person's shoes if they need a full medical leave or something of that nature. The other item that's really come to, or rather has elevated itself in terms of importance, is making sure individuals know what they're reviewing for when they fill a review cycle or a control function. So I think in person, it was a little bit easier for folk to ask questions and to get timely answers. In the remote work environment, it's a bit different. And I don't see the remote work environment really changing a whole lot after the pandemic. I think folk have gotten really used to working from home and being able to balance the work life and the work life issues. So we're kind of expecting that there will be an ongoing remote environment, but part of that's going to require that individuals know how to execute their internal control functions so that they continue to comply. Initially, there were just individuals checking boxes and reviewing and approving timesheets, but they had no idea what folk were actually doing all day. So I think that type of training, so that we can really adjust to what's likely a long-term shift in what the workplace looks like going forward, is going to be pretty important.
Great. And one last question. George Floyd in Minneapolis, the Black Lives Matter movement has made it really clear that different demographic groups are impacted differently by government. And so my question is, thinking about it as a grant manager, should there be a thought or policy or other sorts of mechanisms put into place to think about equitability of outcomes from programs that are funded by grants?
Interesting question.
And while you think for a minute, I learned something in artificial intelligence that was really, I think, fascinating, which is artificial intelligence algorithms take advantage of data that's there. And so they learn from it. With machine learning, they essentially may very well tend to discriminate because they kind of take advantage of information that kind of may already be differential and inequitable treatment on its surface. So there may be some need to kind of make a positive effort to ensure that as you implement artificial intelligence or machine learning, that it's fair and that it is equitable. And I recognize that those tools aren't really used within the grants management community, but it also strikes me that kind of, there may well be grant award mechanisms that similarly kind of are inequitable. And I'm just curious whether or not any of you as panelists have any perspective on where that's being considered or if it's being considered at this stage.
I'm not aware of any considerations around the DE&I perspective at the grant awardee, the grant making level. But I don't know if others are.
Well, we can very quickly maybe get some insight into that from the amount of time it took some lower income communities, for example, to gear up and ramp up for the use of technology during during the pandemic, even for education. How many of our students were out of the classrooms because they didn't have laptops or they don't have computers? We saw tremendous inequity here, and I think the whole country is aware of that, as we certainly are in education.
To a certain extent, it's telling us talk about
I was
these.
just gonna say my wife is a teacher, and so yeah, I've seen that where there's big Chromebook handouts, for those that can afford it, obviously. So I think that those topics are on everybody's mind, and certainly we're there'll more to come for how we can address those. Yep.
Yeah, personally, I think this is a topic that has not really been addressed significantly in the grants management community. And I think there's certainly room for improvement. Perhaps it could be a kind of an upcoming topic of focus and attention. Just as Blanca says, I think it's not something we all notice immediately, but if you look for it, it's there.
Absolutely.
All right, well, sorry?
No, I said absolutely. I fully agree.
So we're coming up on the hour. I want to very much thank each of you panelists for taking the time to kind of familiarize yourself with the survey results and to be ready to answer questions that I think are of interest to a lot of folks in the community. I think the evidence of that is we had almost twice as many participants today as we've had for any of the previous annual sessions over the last 4 years. As I said, we'll share with the folks, of course, panelists as well, but all of the participants will share the slides. We'll give you access, if you'd like it, to a recording so you can watch this same event over and over again if that's what you're interested in doing. And as well, some of the things that have been mentioned, such as Craig's URL for the blockchain pilot, as well as some of the materials that Blanca shared. Blanca, I might just ask, one of the attendees said, the grantee satisfaction report that Department of Education is doing would be really helpful to others. So perhaps if you're able to share information about that or a URL to access it, we can provide those sorts of information in our follow-up as well. But thank you all very much. We really appreciate it. And I hope this has been something that's been useful and interesting to each and all of the participants. Thanks again.